Okay, well, we're going to get started here. Thank you all for being here. We're so excited to dive into corporate chief of staff versus startup chief of staff. You may or may not know that Clara's background is in the startup world, startup chief of staff world. My background, I've grown up in the corporate world, chief of staff in a corporate environment. So we're going to just dive into all the things. We had over 800 people register for this webinar, which means usually about 200, 300 people show up. And Clara and I thought, you know what? Let's call our friend Katie and have Katie come help us moderate. So what we're going to do today is basically go through a few slides, tell you about ourselves, and then Katie's going to walk through a Q&A with us and then open up for a big long time of audience Q&A. So if you've been on a webinar before with us, just navigate down to the Q&A button on your screen. No questions in the chat. So Nova, Team Nova, Nova Chief of Staff, I'm founder of Nova. Our team will be in the chat moderating. We'll add some links. We'll let you know how to find us on LinkedIn and our companies and all that good stuff. But questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A box of this webinar. So before we get going, again, welcome Katie. Katie, thanks for jumping in to help us moderate here. To tell you a little bit about Katie, Katie Montbriand spent a decade leading transformation at a Fortune 500 company. As chief of staff for a 1,000-person organization, she pioneered a groundbreaking team of culturists dedicated to boosting employee engagement and fostering genuine workplace connections. Now, with her latest venture, Lived and Loved, Katie is channeling her passion for positive disruption and storytelling into helping people share their career journeys in fresh, impactful ways. So she's especially excited to bring Chief of Staff stories to life through a custom LinkedIn and resume package, partnering with us at Nova. So if you're interested in some coaching, navigate over to novachiefofstaff.com/coaching, and you can see her storytelling coaching package that we've put together for folks interested in coaching through Nova. And then obviously, go ahead and find Katie's information in the chat. Our team will pop that in there and you can go check out everything Katie Montbriand. So Katie, thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I might try to slip in my own chief of staff story here and there as we get into the conversation because it's one of my all-time favorite topics.
Please do. We would absolutely love that. Okay, awesome. Well, I think what we're going to do now is we've got 4 or 5 slides to share with you, just to kind of level set on a few things for Clara and my background. So we are going to walk through that and then we'll take the slides away and just open back up to this view and have a conversation here with Katie. So with that, I'll pass it over to Clara to share.
Amazing. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here and let me know if everybody can see that. Just
looks good.
Panelists here. Okay, amazing. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for having myself and Maggie and Katie here. We're super excited to be bringing you this Nova chat. It's my first Nova chat as well. So excited to be here. So quick, like I said, like Maggie said, we're not going to have a ton of slides. This is going to be a super light slide presentation here just to give you a little bit of intros on Maggie and myself. I'm going to talk 2 slides about just an overview of the startup chief of staff role, and then Maggie will do the same with the corporate chief of staff role, and then we open it up for questions. So I'm going to get started. If I haven't met you before, which I'm sure I haven't met all of you on this call, which I'm excited to be meeting you all soon and hopefully connecting on LinkedIn after this. I'm the founder of Ask a Chief of Staff. We offer a community for current and aspiring chiefs of staff to come together and share their knowledge. We also offer coaching with career guidance and small group executive coaching. And we also do placement as well. So we match chiefs of staff with their future executives to hopefully build that amazing principal chief of staff relationship. Myself, I come from a startup background, as Maggie mentioned. So I was a chief of staff at a Series A company at the time, and then we went through our Series B while I was there, a company called Hugging Face in the AI natural language processing space. During that time, we grew from 10 people to 45 in the little over a year that I was there. And I always like to say that I was either employee number 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10, depending on when we walked in the door that day, because a whole bunch of us all started at the same time. And so we all have a different number depending on how you like to count us. does. So my experience has mostly been in the startup world, AngelList, 𝗶𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀, a little technical recruiting firm that I was part of. We were all less than, I would say 60 people at all of these different companies. Largest company I ever worked at was about 300 people. So very much in that startup realm. And I'm excited to be sharing my experience with you all today. I'm going to give you, pass the mic over to Maggie to introduce herself. And I'm sure many of you already know her, but a quick.
Yeah, and probably just like Clara, a lot of people don't. So real quick here. So I'm the founder of Nova Chief of Staff. We are the premier destination for Chief of Staff education and development. We launched a course last year that has been phenomenally well received in the market, which just makes my heart sing. We've got, gosh, I think we're like a couple people shy of 500 enrollments in our course, and we just hit 100 grads, which is super exciting. And we have people in our course across 21 different countries. So in addition to our course, which you can absolutely learn more about on our site, I always recommend just like checking out the syllabus to see if it's something that looks interesting to you. But we do a lot of coaching. I love to consult. I miss it a little bit. I'm still consulting in smaller ways, but I'm looking to get back out there and do a little bit more hands-on heavy lifting consulting too soon. So my background, as we mentioned, is in the corporate world. So before I was sort of in like back of house, I was on the front lines with customers at Starbucks, at Macy's, and at many other spots. And then I ended up moving into a buying role at Nordstrom, and then into a leadership executive kind of development program at T-Mobile. So I was at Nordstrom for, I think, 5 or 6 years, at T-Mobile for almost 3. And, I just kind of feel like I've grown up in the corporate world. With that, let's see. So in my chief of staff role, I had the privilege of building out a team of 7 or so direct reports on my chief of staff team. I was this president's first chief of staff. It was my first chief of staff role. And through, I think, across about 11 months, I redesigned role after role after role and basically implemented and added a lot of new functions onto our team, which was really great. And before being chief of staff, I led COVID response for all of our retail stores and return to office efforts for our B2B world of 5,000 employees when I was chief of staff. And then after about 2 years in the role, I'm like a build chief of staff. We could totally get into like kind of the different profiles, which is always fun, but I love the build. Team was built, things were rocking and rolling, felt really good. And I was kind of ready for the next challenge to go consult, and then ended up building this chief of staff course. So that's it for me there. I'll pass it back to you, Clara.
Amazing. So I'm just going to give a quick slide overview of how I view the chief of staff role when it comes to the startup phases. Startup, in my opinion, is, usually in its earlier stages of business. I would say, let's say less than 10 years in business. I mean, I know that the definition of a Series A through Series B or C or beyond can vary, but we're very much in that kind of building a product. Maybe you don't have a product, or you're trying to go to market or something like that. So that's what we'll kind of use as our definition of as startup. And so you'll see here, I put kind of 4 phases of funding stages here. If you're not familiar with what VC-backed startups are, it's usually you're taking some institutional money from a venture capital firm, and you're raising that money in order to fund your business to actually go build the product, hire people, etc. So I like to kind of use this sliding scale here. The earlier stage you are, or seed stage companies, chief of staff is going to be very complementary to your principal. So the things that your principal may be weaker at or could use a little bit more support in because they're not working on, that's where a chief of staff can really come in to help support. And so you're very much these like fitting puzzle pieces, versus as you get later and later stage, as your principal, your CEO's scope of responsibilities grow, your chief of staff is going to lean a little bit heavier on the amplification side. So how can you be a force multiplier, make sure that all the things that they want to get done are being covered by both yourself and your principal? At the end of the day, the role is always going to be a mix of both complement and amplifier, but I see that it skews a little bit more heavy one way as the company tends to scale and grow. And so in terms of skill sets, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in the Q&A, as your earlier stage, kind of that pure operational generalist is going to be more of a heavy hitter here, versus as you move to the later stages, you're going to be more of that strategic thought partner. Maybe you're not executing directly as much, but you're still very much involved in that kind of high level strategic decision making. So fluidity is very key here, the capacity to adapt and expand. And we can talk a little bit about my own transition from Series A to B and how my role changed over the duration of those 14 months that I was a chief of staff. And I'm happy to answer more questions, but I'll leave you with this graphic for now, and then I will pass them back over to Maggie to talk a little bit about corporate considerations.
Amazing. And just as a reminder, find that Q&A box down below. That's where Katie, our moderator, is going to help pull questions for us as we get to audience Q&A. So our last slide here is just really talking kind of about some corporate considerations as a chief of staff. So generally, and all of these are so fluid, but generally a larger executive team. So your leader may have a lot more direct reports that you're driving alignment for. There's a lot of key internal and external stakeholders. For example, at T-Mobile, I think there were, we grew to 18 or 21 executive team members for the company once T-Mobile acquired Sprint. So that's a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders. You add the board, you add your leader's executive team, the people that report to your leader. It's a lot. The level of polish might be higher. So a lot of times I talk with students in Nova's course around polish. Now, if you are a Fortune 40 company delivering a presentation to a board, your slide deck is probably going to be absolutely perfect. If you're in the startup world, like now that I'm a founder, I definitely am not expecting that from my team, and I don't want them spending their time on that way. So it's a bit of a range of the level of polish required depending on the setting that you're in. And that could come down to presentation, reports, briefs, even like getting dressed up for the day, depending on who you're, in person with, if that's the case. Your leader in a corporate environment could be across a lot of different levels of a company. So chiefs of staff exist under other titles across many different levels of leaders in companies. Definitely, obviously, CEO, C-suite, but also presidents and executive vice presidents and VPs, senior VPs, directors. They also often have chiefs of staff, and it may be under a title like business operations manager, but they are the one behind the scenes pulling the decks together for the leader, running the all hands. They are that leader's strategic support person, and that's how you identify that they are the chief of staff. Often in the corporate environment, depending on how big the team is and the company is, you may have dedicated support for board and investor relations versus the startup environment. You're probably all hands on deck there helping with all that. There may be people hired specifically for investor relations. So you're working with those folks when those times come around to prepare materials. Navigating the leaders team and driving alignment is a big part of the job because the executives team is so big. Often you are not the most senior person in the room. So sometimes on a smaller team, you may be kind of running the show. Let's say you have 10, 20 people in your company, you're helping, carry through the leaders' initiatives and goals, and you're helping really run things. You're also doing that in a corporate environment, but your title may be much more junior than the people in the room with you. So it's a lot of that influential leadership that I'm sure you'll see on both sides, startup and corporate. You may have more resources. As I mentioned, I hired a team of 7 to support me as chief of staff back office. It was a huge undertaking of 5,000 employees and a $14 billion business. So the support was necessary, but we did have resources, and generally those resources are available depending on the company and also depending on the startup. You may be navigating consulting relationships. So the chief of staff may be the one who's working with Deloitte or McKinsey on the initiative that they're helping the CEO with, and you're kind of the interface there. Could also happen in startup worlds, but they're definitely utilized quite a bit in the corporate world in terms of consultants. You often will have a peer chief of staff to reach out to. And I was thankful and lucky to have Kristen Gee, my friend Kristen, to reach out to, who'd been a chief of staff much longer than me. And can I get a template? What should I do here to set me up for success? Help me a little bit, where a lot of chiefs of staff really feel alone on an island when they're the only one, which is very understandable and often the case in a smaller startup environment. What's a little bit surprising that I've found through my career is that the big companies they also don't have it all together. So there's not often processes, there's not often systems. There's a lot of opportunity for you to implement those things. I wanted to include that here because it's a big part of the job also in the corporate world, setting up those systems and processes. And then this is just a logistical one, but I talk a lot with students and it really depends who has Microsoft, who has Google, Google Slides, PowerPoint. Generally, the big corporate giants are on Microsoft. Startup world, I think Claire is a Googler, as we've established. I'm the Microsoft, these slides are in Google. So anyway, that's kind of where we're at for corporate considerations. We'll dive into any and all of this further, but with that, I think we'll stop sharing and pass it over to Katie to kick off some Q&A from her, and then we'll move to audience Q&A.
Perfect. And the questions that have been coming in already are amazing. So I'm going to just kind of pepper those in as we're having our conversation as well. And please keep them coming. So both of you talked a bit about your experience in the chief of staff world and kind of the themes of the startup world versus the corporate world. But just to level set, can I have you each define what you see as the scope and impact of the chief of staff role from those respective domains? And Clara, I'll pass it to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. Many of you have probably seen me write about this already, but I like to define the chief of staff role by its acronym, COS, and each of those letters stands for culture, operations, and strategy. I think at an early stage company, those are probably the biggest things that you could be working on. And so that is usually a great indication of whether or not you should be working on something. So, I like to make the comparison, right? Many folks are like, well, what about scheduling? Should I be doing scheduling? Does that feel like it fits under culture, operations, and strategy? My answer is no. And so that shouldn't be on your plate versus something like offsite planning. That should definitely fall under our chief of staff plate because that's going to go into both culture and strategy, right? Building the culture of the team. What does that offsite look like? But also strategic planning and the other things that happen during an offsite. So that's the framework that I would encourage you to think about when it comes to the startup role. And then Maggie, I'm going to pass it over to you to talk a little bit more about the corporate side.
Yeah, this definition is what I use for all chiefs of staff. And I love that it's different than Claire's because Claire's acronym of culture, operations, strategy is great. And it's super simplified and it really helps you narrow in. I'm going to give a longer definition of the chief of staff role that can be applicable to all chiefs of staff, just to have another comparison here. So a chief of staff is the business leader's strategic thought partner who's excellent at execution and allows the business leader to focus on what's most important: vision, strategy, growth, and leadership. Just like an EA, a chief of staff supports the leader directly. They exist to support that leader, but in a highly strategic role that at its core is focused on driving the leader's many business initiatives forward quickly and efficiently, solving problems, removing roadblocks along the way. The chief of staff also often acts as a proxy for the leader, driving alignment across the leader's executive team and leading major cross-functional projects.
Great. I see love for both of those definitions coming through in the comments. I think you both nailed it. So to poke a little further on this, what's your take on, do you have to have worked in that environment before to be a successful chief of staff? So do you have to have worked at a startup to be a startup chief of staff? Do you have to have a corporate background to be a corporate chief of staff?
I'll go first, and then again, Maggie, I'll pass it over to you. For my personal opinion, let's call it, I don't think you have to have worked at a startup in order to go then work at a startup. I think it's helpful, right? Context is always helpful. And the same reason why I generally do not recommend that you take a chief of staff role right out of graduation or have it be your first role. It's the same reason why I would say it's ideal if you have worked in a startup environment before and then go to be a chief of staff in a startup environment again. And the reason for that is just context, right? If you've never worked in an office, I wouldn't recommend going into a chief of staff role right away because there's just so much you just don't know about, like, just corporate culture in general. Like, you don't know how to manage direct reports, or you haven't had a manager before, or you don't even know your own working style. And so for those same reasons, if you haven't worked in a startup environment and you're coming from somewhere that maybe is a little bit more resource heavy, or there are more direct lines of direct reporting, or you are using a Microsoft Office and a startup is using Google Suite, you're just going to have more things that you need to learn on the fly. And so if you want to set yourself up best for success, having that context prior is going to be helpful. That being said, it's not impossible, right? I've seen many management consultants become chiefs of staff at early stage startups, and that's a completely different setting and environment. It's definitely possible. But again, I think it's really about setting yourself best up for success, and having that context is going to be most beneficial for you. So that's my opinion on the startup side of things.
And I agree with Clara. So I'm totally aligned there.
All right. So, Maggie, I'll throw this one over to you first. What are the 2 or 3 truly essential skills that someone needs to be chief of staff in a corporation, and one that might not matter as much in that environment?
Well, let's see. I think I'm curious what Claire is going to say from a startup perspective. I have a couple ideas too here, but I think that there's a strong level of executive project management that is highly necessary for all chiefs of staff. I can imagine it's very important in the startup world to be able to keep things organized and running smoothly and fast and efficiently as well. So this one is really for both corporate and startup. When it comes to corporate specifically, I would say that there's got to be a bit of a level of comfort interfacing with senior leaders and kind of that polish, that networking, that executive presence where you feel maybe that it's a little bit natural or just not super uncomfortable to be learning in an environment with people who might be much more senior than you, who lead a company. And that can be kind of startling at first. You're like, what am I doing? Where am I? This is a lot. But that level of comfort can come over time with different, through networking or internships or different roles that put you adjacent to senior leadership. So I think that executive presence, that level of polish is helpful. I think I really believe, and I talk about this a lot just in my own thought leadership in our course, that the qualities that make a great chief of staff are going to make a great chief of staff anywhere. And so just real quick to dive into a few of those, you're fast, you're driven, you're curious, you're growth minded. I mentioned executive presence, you're achievement focused, high EQ, breadth versus depth. I love to use the term expert generalist, problem solving, solution oriented, great at a lot of things, learns quickly, asks questions, collaborative, kind of that influential leader, wants more, wants that responsibility with senior leadership. But I don't believe there's too many things that would require you to be successful in a corporate environment versus not as a chief of staff.
I see Clara nodding to that. Do you have anything that you want to add or tweak for the startup world?
I really love this executive project management and understanding how to balance and prioritize. I think that's a huge one. I think that one thing that I get a lot of questions about are should I take this financial modeling course, or should I learn SQL, or should I learn Excel? And the short answer for all of those things is if that is a skill set that you want to build, yes, of course, hard skills are always going to be beneficial to you in any sort of capacity. But I really think that the soft skills, or what I like to call people skills, are ultimately what's going to win out in your chief of staff career. You could be the best person modeling things in Excel, but if you can't communicate what it is that you're modeling to the rest of the executive team, to the rest of the team that you're trying to get on board, it's not going to matter as much as you having the power of soft influence, of authority, of delegation without power, right? All of these things that are relatively, I would say, hard to learn from a book or from a course. And so, yes, having high EQ is just super important. And I think that ultimately a chief of staff role at the end of the day is a people role. It's really about understanding the people that you're working with. It's about understanding your principal and being able to communicate with them and push back when necessary. And so when people ask me, what can I work on? You can work on a lot of these skills in your current roles already. You don't have to go out to find another course, not to say that you shouldn't, but a lot of these people skills you can be already working on a day-to-day basis as you're networking, as you're talking to other people, and really start to build out those skill sets over, a hard skill that you can learn on the job as well.
Yeah, totally agree. So some of this is going to be interesting, right? Because Katie's asking us, what what do we think, is specific to the corporate role and specific to the startup role? And I think, we'll see in half an hour, right? But what are the takeaways? Are the takeaways that they're more similar than they are different? Are the takeaways that there's going to be a few clear things? And in this case, I think both of us are really aligned here that a great chief of staff is a great chief of staff, and those skills and those people skills are equally as important in both environments.
Great point. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of someone considering a chief of staff role. Now, this is a question that came in from one of our audience members. How would you advise someone who comes to you for coaching or guidance on, should I choose the corporate route? Should I choose the startup route? From what do you want to develop from a professional track perspective, or any of those other considerations that you would throw out if someone came to you with that question?
Yeah. Well, I can start on this one. I think it depends on your goals. I often talk about, and maybe we can sit here for a minute and chat through how we got our chief of staff roles, but I often talk about, the easiest way to land yourself a chief of staff job is in your current environment. So if your primary goal is to be a chief of staff, then focus on being a chief of staff in your current environment. I got my chief of staff job through networking. I was in an executive development program. I met and interfaced with the executive team members. So we had, lightly knew each other, but enough to build trust, enough to build credibility and a strong reputation. And then, I had a peer who was a chief of staff. I didn't know what a chief of staff was, but I learned from her that, oh, this sounds really up my alley. This sounds really good. She then, connected me to somebody who was hiring for the chief of staff roles. Happens to be that I knew that leader from my interviewing and networking experience in my executive development program. So I think the most important thing is to figure, what are your primary goals? If it is to ultimately be a chief of staff sooner than later, work your current environment. If you are like, well, I've worked in the startup world and I've worked in the corporate world, what do you love? Like, what drives you? What are you most passionate about? Always start there. So I'll let Clara weigh in on this one too.
Yeah. And I can give a brief kind of story about how I landed my role as well. I applied, I applied to my role, but I applied specifically on a startup focused job board. So many people I know are looking on LinkedIn, which has a lot of different roles. But again, the main things is that, and many of you have probably seen this Venn diagram, right? You need to kind of come up with a couple different lists. Like, what are things you're good at? What are things you enjoy doing? What brings you, what can make you money? And kind of find what is that Venn diagram overlap, and that's where being a chief of staff is going to be the best for you. So there's a lot of different ways you can come into a chief of staff role. I love the idea of using your organization, kind of seeing where you are already and where are there opportunities for you to move up, because you already have context of the environment that you're in. I think, Shauna, you're saying here in the chat, having institutional knowledge is going to be hugely beneficial for you. But if you're looking to go outside of where you are, because let's say your company is not interested in having a chief of staff, or, that's just not a priority, look for places where your skill sets are going to be the most transferable, and that is going to get you your best shot. Always look for networking opportunities. Networking happens both inside and outside of your company. Find ways to talk to people who are in positions that you would like to be at. So I always tell folks who are looking for jobs, get super narrow and specific. You want to be at a startup? What stage of startup? A, B, or C? Those are all very different. You want to be at a startup? What kind of startup? Industry-wise, you have fintech, you have health tech, you have all these different types of startup products and industries. The more narrow you get, the better you are going to be about telling your narrative of how your skill set is going to fit into that environment, and it's going to make you that much more compelling.
Love that.
A quick follow-up on that. We've had a couple questions about startups and funding and some of these more nitty-gritty, like startup world things. How much do you have to know about funding, about these different stages of startups to get in the door? How important is that?
So I'm going to give you the frustrating answer, which is every single chief of staff question that you'll ask. And the short answer is it depends. And the longer answer is that, again, it's all contextual, right? So for example, I went to a company that was very heavy and deep into the natural language processing and AI world. I myself have no experience in that. I'm not an engineer. I've never trained a large language model. But at that stage, we were Series A. Like I said, we were less than 10 people. And so working on the product was not a priority for the chief of staff. The product was being handled by the engineers that we had, the scientists, the CTO, the CEO. They were all handling the product. And what they really needed help with was the operations side. One story I like to tell is that on day 2 of my job, one of our employees came up to us and said, "My wife had a baby last week. What's our parental leave policy?" And it wasn't something that we had because we were such a small team. And so I really had to go. I didn't have experience in building that, but that was then go out, find the best practices out there. What kind of insurance do we need to have? What is standard? All of these different things. And so it was more about that, like, go figure it out attitude. Once we moved from Series A to B, then product became a very, very important part of my role. All of that stuff, all the operational stuff, all the kind of basic HR people operations was already put into place. And now the company was evolving into something more mature. So depending on where you slot in at the stage of company, that's going to be the most important. Some companies are going to have an easier time raising institutional funding, and some are going to have a harder time. So if it's, let's say a product that is maybe a little bit more niche, or they don't have as big of an audience, you're going to have to go and pitch more companies and pitch more VCs. That's where having that understanding of what the VC world looks like is going to be more helpful versus if your company like already has a lot of institutional funding lined up, you may not need to flex as hard on that skill set. So again, it's about understanding the startup and where they are in their progress, in their journey, and again, translating your experience over so that it makes the most sense.
Yeah. And with anything chief of staff related, we figure it out, right? We don't always know the answer. I didn't know the difference between A, B, C, and D before I started consulting for a startup last year, but I wanted to be in the know. I wanted to be, understand what was going on. I researched it and I figured it out. And it didn't come up a lot in my role. I really didn't have to have a deep understanding of that. The founders did, right? I was there to do some fractional chief of staff work that didn't touch those things. So we can figure it out. And, from hearing Clara talk about this, it just makes me think so deeply about the most important thing being truly understanding the value that you can add to the company, understanding what the company needs, understanding the value you can add, and then having the confidence to pitch yourself as somebody that can really step in and help. So.
Sounds like with many things, chief of staff, go do some digging, ask some good questions, and you'll usually be all right at the end of the day. We've gotten quite a few questions about this distinction between EA and chief of staff and how that shows up in the job search, how that shows up in different companies from the chat. So this one, I'm going to point to you first, Clara. It says, executives often view chiefs of staff and EAs as one and the same when you're working at a startup. How do you help to define the difference between the two and really show your leadership that they aren't the same role in a startup environment?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do think that there can be a conflation of these two titles, but I think Maggie and I both agree an EA is an EA and a chief of staff is a chief of staff. These are very different roles, and that's obviously part of the education that we are trying to put out in the world as well. I think there is a confusion about what it means to be all hands on deck, an all hands on deck chief of staff at a startup versus being EA centric or EA heavy. And I think sometimes people confuse the two. So are there times that I did have to schedule some meetings? Yes, I'm not saying like that was totally off my plate. We never had to do it, but it wasn't the main crux of my role, right? I wasn't spending, let's say, 80% of my time doing it. Instead, I was spending 80% of my time doing more of these like strategic, larger project initiatives. I think that, again, what people confuse is that because a company is very small, you just simply don't have as many resources. You don't have an EA yet. And so maybe if the founder has chosen, like, I do want a chief of staff at this point, if everybody else, and I think somebody else in the chat was like, I was the first non-engineering hire, same for me, you know, there's going to be things that fall on your plate that may feel a little bit EA-esque, but again, it's not because your company is viewing you as an EA, it's because there's simply nobody else to do it. And so eventually what did happen was that we did end up hiring a virtual EA, because I was like, hey, look, if I keep spending my time, it is starting to grow to a point, because we have so many more client meetings and we have so many other things that we would need to get involved in. If I start to spend my time here, the stuff that's on the strategic side is going to suffer. So it was a conversation that I had, right, with my principal to say, I think it's time for us to bring in a virtual EA. It's going to give me more leverage, and then it's going to give you more leverage, right? It's a transitional effect through the transitive property for each of us to get more leverage. And so I really try to encourage people to think about that. We can talk about like looking at job descriptions and seeing if it's more EA versus a true chief of staff position, of course, and that's all in language. But sometimes it can be hard to tell until you get into that startup. And then as a strategic thought partner to your principal, it is your job to push back and say like, look, this is not the best use of my time. You know, I could do this. It's not that it's beneath me or I shouldn't be doing it, but you're not utilizing me to the fullest of my potential if I'm spending time doing more administrative work when I could really be helping you in all these different other aspects.
Yeah.
That is
Totally
such an
agree.
elegant solution to say, someone has to do this. Here's a better way for all of us. I love how you framed that, Clara.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maggie, the version of this I want to ask you is, I know you work with a lot of EAs who are making this transition from EA to chief of staff.
Yeah.
What are some of the gaps that you're seeing as people make that jump? And what's your best advice for people to kind of make that shift from executor to strategic partner, strategic advisor?
Yeah, for sure. You know, I think just like adding real quickly onto Clara's point too, I agree with everything Clara said, is that the core functions of the EA role are generally not seen in chief of staff work, which is, you know, scheduling, travel, inbox, logistics, expenses. However, EAs often will cross over and take on a project that might have lived with a chief of staff if the company had a chief of staff, but a chief of staff doesn't hardly ever will own those core admin functions. I don't know, Claire, if you're aligned here, but I almost always coach founders and business owners to first get admin support. That's the most important support they should hire for, to not be doing themselves, and then bring on that chief of staff, just for the reasons that Claire talked about. You know, but when we think about EAs moving into the chief of staff role, there's a lot of alignment because you're used to that environment as an EA. You love supporting a principal, and it's not a normal step for all EAs. Most chiefs of staff do not come from the EA world. However, it's happening more and more because EAs are realizing that they can definitely make the jump to chief of staff, you know, if they fit the kind of characteristics and skill set and that drive that we talked about earlier. You know, the gaps are definitely confidence. Confidence, hands-on practice. That's actually why I built Nova's course, to give people hands-on practice, to show them that they can absolutely do the job. Here's a framework. You can do it. Go practice. Okay, great. I know how to do this. Here, I'm going to start here. I'm going to start here. And this is what I'm going to do. But when it really comes down to like the major gaps, it depends on the person, but, you know, having the confidence to speak up, having the confidence to make a strategic recommendation, thinking about the future when you're doing those kind of tactical projects. So it's really changing the lens from the everyday role of EA, which is doing a million things, being having the support, the backbone of the company, right? Or the business. But it's mostly focused on kind of the today and the doing and all the things that need to get done. The lens has to change. So Clara, we both said, you know, chiefs of staff have to be 10,000 foot view and be able to be in the weeds. So it's pulling out the EA from that doer mentality and really kind of moving into, okay, what is the effect on tomorrow? What information do people need about this thing happening? What are the questions that are going to be asked of me for the thing happening next month, which a lot of EAs are doing in different ways. But when it comes to chief of staff responsibility, it's just a constant blend of that strategic versus that operational and executional. So, you know, I would say there, I think there's some tactical things like, oh, I haven't spent a ton of time in PowerPoint or Google Slides, and now I'm needing to provide visibility to my leadership team of, you know, in new and different ways. All those things can be learned, right? The biggest pieces are really, you know, the confidence and validation that you can absolutely do the job.
Anything to add to that, Clara?
Yeah, I like I know there's a lot of questions about if I'm an EA, how do I move myself into a chief of staff role, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if you're planning on making this move internally, let's say going from EA to chief of staff, which Maggie said, you know, internal movement is always great, and I agree. The main thing to keep in mind here is that somebody needs to take over your EA responsibilities in order for you to become a fully fledged chief of staff. Otherwise, it's very hard to straddle both, because ultimately, like, is the scheduling thing going to have a more immediate deadline over, you know, working on a long-term project that's going to take more time? Yes, right? So you're going to get saddled down with a lot of your more tactical administrative things unless you do bring in someone. And so for folks who are looking to make that transition internally, really talk to your principal if they are the ones helping you spearhead this. Like, okay, what are we going to do about my backlog? Who is going to take over all the things that I was doing so that I can make that true transition from tactical to strategic? Because that's something that I see a lot of EAs who make that transition internally struggle with, is that they're like, well, I'm trying, I want to work on more of these projects and I want to do, you know, these bigger things, but people keep coming to me and they keep asking me to schedule a meeting. They keep asking me to take notes, or they keep asking me to do these things. And it's because there's a gap now, right? There's a void, and they only know to go back to you. So really think about, as part of your transition plan, either hiring a backfill or hiring a virtual EA or something that's going to be able to take off those administrative duties so that you are able to then free up your own time and space to work on those bigger projects.
Yeah, we have a lot of resources for this, you know, pitch documents and some reflection and work, you know, kind of some worksheets and proposals at novachiefofstaff.com/resource library. So check that out for sure. You know, Claire's absolutely right. You have to have the conversation, but I would even structure it a step further as a recommendation. So you are, you know, mentally and physically like stepping into this chief of staff role. Maybe you're not there yet, right? But you are acting as your one. You're putting a deck together. If that's the level of polish and elevation you need, maybe it's just a conversation. You're suggesting, you know, here's what I'd like to do. My time is better spent over here. Do you agree? You know, these are the things I've started doing. And is it high value to you? Great. So I would recommend that these other items that we backfill for a much more junior admin to take on so that I can spend the majority of my time here. This is what this could look like. I can put the job description together. Here's the transition timeline. Do the work for them, present it, you know, show that level of research and polish that you want to convey as their future chief of staff. And it may not be for your current leader, but it could absolutely be for another leader kind of in your universe. So make sure that you're networking and having conversations with everybody in your environment and letting your goals be known, and, you know, taking advice and suggestions for how to get there from other folks in your world.
Do either of you, so if we back up, that's a great answer on how do you navigate the transition when your company's ready for the transition. How do you even start that conversation if you're in an organization and you're looking around and saying, I'm kind of doing some chief of staff work. I think you actually need a chief of staff, but there's this hesitation, maybe because they don't understand the role or don't see the path for you to get there. How would you start that version of the conversation?
You can go for it, Clara.
Okay. So I think that in any position that you're in, right, you should be having a relatively regular career chat with your manager, with a higher up. So there's a couple of different things that I think you can do, and maybe easier in a corporate environment when you have more people, right? But also you can do this at a startup as well. So whoever your direct manager is, you should be having a pretty consistent conversation, right? And if chief of staff becomes an avenue that you would like to walk down, as soon as that even small thought comes into your head, you should start to surface that immediately, because of all of these reasons that Katie, you mentioned, right? Maybe they don't have a chief of staff at this company. Maybe it's a new role. Maybe they don't know what it is. And so the moment that you even think about it, you should bring it up in your next career conversation, right? Like, hey, like, I've been doing some research. This chief of staff role sounds super interesting to me. And then from there, you're going to be able to gauge, like, they're like, oh, yes, we do know what chiefs of staff are, or like, what is that? I've never heard of it. And so that's where you can kind of know how to build on the conversation. And it's going to take time. Like, this is not an overnight thing. You're not going to say, I want to be a chief of staff, and they're going to be like, let's get you in that role. It's always I would say, learning by doing, and you're showing your chief of staffness already by pitching this idea. So it's a little bit of this, like, very tenacious, I want this role, so I'm going to start to create it for myself. if you're in a larger organization, you should be looking for mentors, right, within your organization, maybe not in your direct line. Maggie mentioned this, like this was somebody that was a peer or somebody that you knew, and then they were able to kind of like look through the organization for you to see where there may be a potential opening for you. So, make it heard around your network. I wouldn't like, it's not, again, you have to be tactful about it, right? If this is not a bang the drum and like wave the banner, but talk to the people that are important to you, who have your best interests at heart, so that they can start to advocate for you. And if you're at a startup or you don't have this within your company, you have mentors, you have external people, you've joined networks, communities, all these people who can start to advocate for you as well, and let them know that this is what you're interested in. Yeah. Then as you start to have these conversations, also put yourself up, volunteer for projects that are outside of your scope. I think it's so important. And this is kind of how I started figuring out, like, I wanted to be a chief of staff too, was that I was in an operations role at my prior startup, AngelList, before I became a chief of staff. And I would just kind of pop in and talk to other people on different teams and say like, hey, like I have maybe 5 hours of bandwidth. Like if there's something that I can jump in to help you out with, let me do that. I'd love to do it. And I kind of realized that, oh, that's kind of what I like to do. I like to be able to spread my wings a little bit further, work on some different parts of the business. And that eventually got surfaced up to the CEO, who realized like, oh, you have more understanding about a larger portion of the business than just your operations silo. And so how can we utilize that? And so many chiefs of staff end up doing the role before they officially take on the title. And I would encourage you to feel empowered to do something like that. Don't just feel like, oh, if I don't have the title, I'm not gonna, do XYZ. Like it's really about showing before asking. And I think that in itself is a very chief of staff like attribute that you can have, right? It's like, how can I show that I have this value? How can I show that I'm already influencing others? And that can really set you up for success down the line, when you have all of these different things that you can write down and say, here are all the other ways that I've contributed to the company. I think that my role is now a chief of staff title.
Yeah. The only thing I would add here is just that I think the biggest barrier for business leaders understanding if they need a chief of staff is just awareness and education of the role, which unfortunately falls to you to help educate them on the value of a chief of staff. So personally, deeply understanding what the heck is a chief of staff and being able to articulate it will go a long way. And like Clara said, it kind of has to be a drip, right? Like I'm going to introduce the concept, and then we're going to revisit the concept, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper. And then I'm going to talk about ways that I can actually add value to this specific business and leader. But, your personal deep understanding of the role and ability to articulate the role, and your ability to articulate your value in the role to your business leader is going to be really important. So, do the work there to be able to talk about it. Clara and myself, Nova Chief of Staff, Ask a Chief of Staff, we've got a lot of resources. Check out our websites for you to just like dive in deep, all things chief of staff. And you'll start to feel a lot more comfortable talking about the value that a chief of staff can add to your organization.
All right. I want to add one more question about path into chief of staff before we hit our lightning round. So that was a great discussion about how to do it when you're already in the company and people know you. How should people think about if they're in the general job pool, they're looking for roles, they don't have the chief of staff role on their resume already? How do you competitively position yourself to get attention in this very hot chief of staff market? It seems like it's very popular on the candidate side and on the employer side. So what's your 2 cents on how people can stand out?
I'll go quickly here. I think you can tailor your resume to show your chief of staff skill set. We're in charge of the 5 or 6 bullets, right? That's on our resume. We have to feel good about it, feel that it's authentic and genuine to the work that we've done, but tailor it to chief of staff responsibilities, which is just what I was talking about before. Deeply understand what those chief of staff responsibilities are so that you can tailor your bullets and potentially a de facto title, right? If your leader would feel comfortable with that too, to help people understand like the true work that you were doing or work that might have crossed over into chief of staff work. So there's a lot more I could go into here, but since we're tight on time, I'm going to pass it over to Clara.
Yeah, absolutely. I dropped in 2 books in the chat here that I highly recommend for anybody who is looking for a role, doesn't matter, chief of staff or otherwise. But 2-hour job search is a really great one. It's not going to help you find a job in 2 hours, but what it's going to do is help you narrow down the companies that you're going to be most qualified to go work at, and making sure that it's going to help you stack order them, right? Stack rank them on excitement about it. Do they have an open chief of staff role? Do you have any network or connections or referrals into it? And it's going to kind of help you figure out, where you're going to be the best chief of staff. Ultimately, I think what Maggie is saying, like, it is about tailoring your experience to whatever company that you are most interested in. Then once you have that list of 25 to 50 companies, let's say it, the next book I recommend is called Never Search Alone. And that is going to help you amplify your network and create more opportunity for yourself. So I think there's like a statistic out there that changes like every couple of weeks, like 60 to 70 to 80% of jobs are not publicly posted, right? They're on this, what we call the hidden job market. And in chief of staff roles, it's really, really true, because so many people use their networks and referrals in order to find that person because of this dynamic relationship, right? You have to have a lot of trust, and who better to trust than somebody who's going to be referred to me? So Never Search Alone is going to help you kind of like 2x, 3x, 5x your network, so that you have more people advocating for you. And it's also going to create a group of people around you who are going through something similar, so you can share resources and share information. So those are the two books I recommend for you to read as you go through your job search. The second one in particular gives you like a 10-week process that you can go through. So it's very step by step. So you don't feel like you're just shooting your resume off into the void, but really utilizing the time that you're spending to network with the right people to get your foot in the door, who, if you have a referral to a company, they're going to give you much more insight on what's important for this role, more than what's just on the job description. So you can really tailor your experience to speak to that executive, to show that you are the best candidate for the role.
Great answer. Then I'm going to have to download that book, Clara. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to do lightning round. So we're going to try to get through as many of the open questions, of which there are a lot, in 3 minutes. So I'm going to direct questions to each of you. Give me the shortest answer you can think of. Clara, your number one software recommendation to optimize your day and your exec's day?
In today's world, I'm going to say use ChatGPT for as many things as you can. Like, if you don't know how to use ChatGPT or something similar, that is a great skill set to learn.
Awesome. Maggie, is fractional chief of staff becoming more common?
It totally is. And that's a really, really great way to sell yourself as a chief of staff, even if you end up getting hired full time. Approach like you're fractional, teach someone, tell someone that they need you.
Amazing. Clara, is chief of staff a short-term position or a long-term position that a company will have forever?
That a company will have, I would like to say forever. I mean, I think more and more companies are understanding the importance of a chief of staff role. For an individual, short answer is it depends. It can be a 12 to 24 month stint or 18 to 24 month stint, or I've seen now career chiefs of staff who stay with their principals long term. So there's opportunities for both.
All right. Maggie, as a chief of staff, how do you think about when to delegate?
The minute that I should realize that I should be spending my time on something else, I try to figure out if I can pass off the if the item can be taught and taken on by somebody else, and if it's repeatable, I pass it off.
Perfect. Clara, what is one thing you would never do again as a chief of staff?
Oh my gosh. That's a hard one to think about. I would say yes to everything. I would say like that was definitely a mistake that I made early on, was that I was like, I can't say no to anything. So I'm going to say yes to everything, which then I ended up with way too much and not delegating anything. So saying I will vow never to say yes to everything ever again.
I think we should all take that advice. Maggie, is it possible to balance having a family or caregiving responsibilities with a chief of staff role?
Well, I would say no, probably. I mean, if you're full-time caregiver, then I don't see how you can be full-time able to work unless it's on different hours. This might be a more complex question, but the chief of staff role is more important than almost any role to be in person with your principal with. You can definitely do it online, or, virtually. It happens everywhere virtually too, but it's a role that requires a lot of focus and dedication. So probably short answer would be no.
And last one, I'm going to ask to both of you, starting with Clara. What's one question you ask as a candidate in every interview?
Ooh, I mean, the best indication I can get of a chief of staff is I will always ask, tell me about yourself, and then I will wait and see what this person says. And my hint to all of you is that if you're going over 2 minutes describing yourself, I would cut your elevator pitch down. We could definitely talk more about this, but I'll leave it at that, and we can continue the conversation.
Yeah.
All right, how about you, Maggie?
If I'm interviewing a candidate for chief of staff, there's a lot of great questions. I like to ask questions to figure out how their brain works and listen to how they solve a problem. But I'm going to go with what questions do you have, and really deeply listen to how they've prepared and how they're thinking about the role and what's on their mind.
Amazing. I think we have enough questions for probably another 3-hour session, but we're going to wrap it up for today. So
Darn it.
I'll
Sorry,
pass it over
guys.
to you. For a
Q&A
quick
focused webinar, and it's still not enough time. So well, this was really great. We will send out a recap to everybody who registered. We'll include all the resources, the books that Clara popped in, all of our links, how to meet with us and find us on LinkedIn and find our businesses and all the things. So thank you so much for being here. This was really fun. I learned a lot. Katie, thank you for being here. Clara, as always, you're a great partner to us. And have a wonderful Labor Day, everybody.
So great to see all of you. See you all soon.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.